Welcome to the 2023 Honda Civic Type R, and it's a car that I've really been looking forward to.
Its FK8 predecessor was pretty spectacular, and then before that the FK2, that was actually rather good too. Then there was the Mugen FN2, which I particularly liked, and before that the Bredvan EP3. In short, when it comes to making hot hatches, Honda really knows what it's doing.
All of this is excellent news for this latest Civic Type R, the FL5. But there's one thing that needs addressing straight away, and that is the price tag.
See, in the UK, this car will be available from around £47,000, which spec for spec is about £12,000 more than the FK8 it replaces. And actually, it's about the same price as a bone stock Porsche Cayman.
In anyone's book, this is one pricey Honda. In fact, it's about 3 times as much as the EP3 was priced at when it came out in 2001. Although, you're definitely getting more car for your money now.
Now obviously the FL5 is bigger than the EP3, but it's also longer, lower and wider than the FK8 that it replaces. And as for the styling, well, the FK8 was full-on Darth Vader aggression, especially when it was painted in black, whereas this is more of a subtle menace. And actually, I prefer it. So around the front end, we've got a new bumper and grille design, and that's not just for aesthetics, it also means that the radiator opening, or the opening to the radiator, is 50% larger than it was on the FK8. And also, underneath the bonnet, the air intake is 10% larger, so obviously that helps optimize the airflow that you've got going into the engine. The bonnet itself, you've got a vent where it reduces the negative pressure over the front end, and you've also got a bonnet which is made of aluminium and it's 50% lighter than it was on the FK8. All good things. Move around to the side, we've got the 19-inch alloys with the special compound Michelin Pilot Sport 4S tyres, which are wider than they were on the FK8. And also in the wheel well here, there's a larger duct which reduces the pressure within the wheel well. Then the airflow that goes in through that duct comes out along here, through there, goes down the side skirt and then is flicked away from the rear wheel arch just at the last moment by this little spoiler down here. The rear wheel arch, actually as well, this is interesting, it's now integrated into the body, whereas on the FK8 it wasn't, and the result of that is that there is less pressure fluctuations, which apparently was an issue on the FK8, but I can't say I ever really noticed it. One thing you will notice if you're on a track is the new rear diffuser that works in tandem with the spoiler, which is lower and wider, and the effect of that is that it creates more downforce and pushes the back of the car down during really fast sections.
Overall then, it's quite the catalogue of changes. Yet anyone expecting this to carry on into the powertrain will be disappointed. The FL5's power and torque figures are very similar to the FK8's, and when you add in the 25 kilogram weight increase, it's now about 1,430 kilograms, they will, theoretically, cancel each other out. So, in the real world, what's the difference?
One of my favourite things about the FK8 Civic Type R was how sharp and pointy the front end was, and you could tell as soon as you set off, all you had to do was just wiggle the steering wheel around a little bit around the centre point, and it was just so snappy and immediate. To get anything similar, you need to spend 4 or 5 times as much on a supercar, or get something that's heavily compromised and focused on track days.
With the FL5, they've tightened things up even more. Camber stiffness is increased by 16%, rear body rigidity is up 15%, and that's thanks to using 4 times as much adhesive. There's also stiffer tie rod ends that work with a much more rigid torsion bar to create greater feel in the steering.
Even without driving this and the FK8 back to back, you can tell that there has been a slight improvement. It's building on already awesome levels of agility, so it's not night and day, but it didn't need to be.
To me, it just feels that bit tighter and better weighted than before. The steering and the front end on this is sublime. It's like there's a direct link between the front wheels and your frontal lobe. The steering wheel, it's just there for you to hold on to. And actually, what a steering wheel it is, trimmed in Alcantara. It feels lovely in your hands. It's just the right size. And thankfully, the steering wheel buttons, which were pretty terrible on the FK8, have been improved. So you've got nice tactile buttons if you want to change the radio station or something.
Honda's quest to improve bits of the Civic that were already brilliant doesn't just stop with the steering. The two-part floating brake discs are carried over from the facelifted FK8, but come with upgraded cooling ducts and a new master cylinder. The resulting feel and stopping power is, well, staggering.
They've even had a go at working over that stunning 6-speed manual gearbox, and when I read this in the press pack, I was a bit worried because the 6-speed manual on the FK8 was already incredible, but this just moves it on. It feels more positive, the rev matching is better, it's slicker, the shape of the gear knob is better. I mean, to get anything better than this, you can't. This is the best manual gearbox on offer today, bar none.
Bring all of this together with the sublime rear stability, monster front limited slip diff, and the ability to customize your chosen drive mode, and the FL5 is a small but noticeable step forward from the FK8. Mind you, the interior is undoubtedly more than a small step forward. I already mentioned the improved steering wheel, but the whole cabin is a big upgrade. There's a new infotainment system with wireless CarPlay and Android Auto. There's more space, improved driver assistance tech, an app to evaluate your driving, and, of course, a damn near perfect driving position that's been lowered by 8mm. It's all there, even if the red seats are, well, a bit much. They are comfy though, and the rest of the car doesn't let it down in that respect. Sure, the tyre roar on some surfaces is loud, but the ride is pliant, and it's very easy to drive at low speeds.
Central to this drivability is the engine. Once again, it's a 2-litre 4-cylinder turbocharged petrol, but they've reworked the exhaust and the turbo system to make them more efficient. And that means you've got 324 brake horsepower and 309 pounds-foot of torque. That's an increase of 9 and 14 respectively. You've got 0 to 62 miles an hour coming up in 5.4 seconds. It would be quicker, but putting the power down in front-wheel drive with that much power can be tricky. But the top speed, once you get going, is 170, which for a Honda Civic, that is astonishing.
Crucially though, the torque is available from 300 RPM lower, which means this engine is super flexible and easy to use in everyday driving. Slot it into 6th and accelerate from 40 miles an hour, and there's no fuss, just a surge forward as it smoothly gathers pace.
And that's it. It's buttery smooth. I've driven EVs with a less linear power delivery than this thing. It's more polite, more refined than it used to be, but is that what you really want from a hot hatch? I'm not sure. It doesn't crescendo and give you that big rush towards the top end like it used to do. And because the torque is available from lower down, well, you've got a better spread of power, but again, it doesn't really lend itself towards excitement. Perhaps in an effort to create more excitement in the engine, they've added a bit more augmented engine sound, and honestly, it doesn't really sound that great. Not many augmented engine sounds do, but this, even by that standard, isn't anything special. I'm also not a fan of the amount of rev hang you get, and if you're not sure what that means, well, if I put my foot down now and then quickly come off the accelerator, it's when the revs don't drop quite as quickly as you might expect, and it makes the engine feel more lethargic. Now this is strange because the flywheel on this Civic Type R is lighter than on the FK8, so it can't be that, and I can only imagine it's actually down to emissions, which is the usual reason for spoiling engines now. Overall, this isn't a bad engine at all, far from it. It's actually very good technically, but when it comes to excitement, and when it comes to a car that costs nearly £50,000, I think it needs to offer a little bit more. But here's the thing. Nobody bought the FK8 Civic Type R for its engine, and in fact, they didn't buy any of its rivals for their engines either. It's all about the hot hatch chassis, chuckability, and handling. However, by increasing the price to almost £50,000, the Civic Type R is perilously close to a hot hatch that has one of the greatest engines of all time. This is the Audi RS3, and in its cheapest form is only about £4,000 more than the Civic. It's got all-wheel drive, a dual-clutch gearbox and an even nicer cabin, but most importantly, it houses one of the most incredible power units ever made. This engine is outrageous, just listen to it. There's no other way of putting it. Audi's 2.5 litre 5-cylinder engine is a masterpiece. It's not just brilliant for a hot hatch, this is brilliant in anything. But in this, you have to say that it dominates it like a Carolina Reaper chili atop of a margarita pizza. Oof. No, it's not as linear and progressive as the Type R's engine, and there is turbo lag, but that just means that when everything comes together, the hit is even bigger. You just put your foot down, wait for the boost to come on, and then get fired towards the horizon because, as usual, the Quattro all-wheel drive system does not waste a single ounce of power. The RS3 is properly quick. Audi claims figures of 394 brake horsepower, 369 pounds-foot of torque, and a 0 to 62 mph time of 3.8 seconds. But really, they feel conservative. Aside from the crazy EVs, it's one of the quickest cars off the line that you can currently buy, at any price. You've got to give credit to Audi for keeping this engine alive, because with all the emissions regulations now, it can't have been easy. And yes, I do remember it being even more explosive and exciting in earlier RS3 and TTRS models, but even so, this engine, it blows the Civics away. Okay, so it wouldn't have taken Mystic Meg to predict that the RS3 wins out in the engine department. But what about everything else? After all, the FL5's ability as an all-rounder is part of what makes it so good. So can the RS3 match it across the board? Well, as I hinted before, the cabin and interior is a step up from the Civic. Not as much as it would have been with the SK8, but it's still an improvement. It's a clean, smart design filled with useful tech such as Audi's virtual cockpit and super slick infotainment system. It's even got a fifth seat and a proper sized fuel tank, neither of which the Honda has. So with all of this in mind, you'd think that the RS3 would be the better everyday car. No, actually. See, Honda doesn't charge you extra for things that really ought to be standard on a £50,000 car. Things like adaptive cruise control and a reversing camera. And also, the Honda has the better ride quality. This Audi can get pretty bouncy. And of course, that would probably be acceptable if the Audi had the handling and the balance and the poise of the Civic Type R. But guess what? It doesn't. At nearly 1,600 kilograms, the RS3 weighs around 150 kilograms more than the Civic Type R, and it really shows. The centre of gravity feels higher, and it's more on edge when you ask for a quick direction change. The communication through the steering is far less crisp, and there's a disconcerting lightness around the straight ahead position that really takes some getting used to.
I'm not saying the Audi doesn't handle well, because it's got plenty of redeeming features. There's tons of grip and traction, and that torque shuffling at the rear axle is pretty clever. It can send up to 50% of the car's power to the outside rear wheel, and when you're accelerating out of a corner, you can really feel it work. However, when compared with the Honda, it just feels more contrived. In the Civic Type R, it's like they set out to build a performance car with very little compromise from the start, whereas in this, it feels more like what it is, which is an Audi A3 with some heavy chassis modifications and a pretty damn good engine. The problem for the Honda, though, is that the engine really is spectacular, and in some ways, it's worth the £50,000 price tag all on its own.
Making a decision between these two cars, both so talented in differing ways, is not straightforward. A few years ago, they wouldn't have even been in the same league, but the brilliance of the Honda and narrowing of the price gap makes for an intriguing, if unusual, rivalry where both bring something truly special to the table.
So I'm not sure whether it's a sign of progress or maybe just things that are getting too expensive, but 10 years or so ago, this test wouldn't exist because these two cars would be in a totally different league and price league. And actually what's also interesting is that now neither of these feel like typical hot hatches, because the RS3 is totally dominated by that 2.5 litre 5-cylinder engine. I can't remember another contemporary hot hatch that's had the engine so front and centre of everything that it does. And then the Civic, it doesn't really feel like a hot hatchback. It feels more like a front-wheel drive sports car that just so happens to have 4 seats and a big boot. Back in the days when Lotus were branching out a little bit and making the Evora, this, well, if they'd made a front-wheel drive hot hatchback, this probably would have been how it would have driven. And that's very high praise indeed. But when it comes to which one I'd spend my own near £50,000 on, it's a tough choice because they genuinely are brilliant cars, both of them, even for that kind of money. But for me, the Civic. And I say that because everything about it just comes together so cohesively. The RS3, that engine is magnificent, but it feels like they tried to bring the rest of the car, the A3 chassis, they tried to bring it up to that engine's level, and it's been a bit of a struggle. They've really had to push it. Whereas with this, it's been built from the ground up with this Civic Type R in mind. They knew how good it was. They knew how successful the car was for them. And everything has just come together, and it feels like all the ingredients are just there to make what is a phenomenal hot hatch. It does move the game on a little bit from the FK8, but that's all it needs to do because that was a brilliant hot hatch. This, it's just got that extra level to it, and for me, that makes it the winner.